I wrote this when I was 17, I think.
I can still smell the whiskey on your breath.
My voice sounds so young.
That poignant sense of those Marlboro Reds. I'm just glad that I brought the dog with me. But although
That was the last time I saw him. And I brought my friend's dog with me. He was like this big fat staffy.
cut ties with you.
Getting bad vibes out.
Cut ties with you. 'Cause you know that you're no good.
That was me. So that was like before anything happened. I grew up in Somerset, where at that time it was far too normal for young girls to get, I would say, groomed by older boys, men, young men. As soon as the relationship started, there was a lot of emotional manipulation and kind of fear-based manipulation. The rape happened so early on, it was almost like after that, it was all rape. I was too young and I didn't have the right education or access to the right support. It was easier for me to just let it happen. It affected me physically just as much as it has emotionally, for sure. I actually really needed a lot of physical therapy, I think, after that relationship, because my body was put through, you know, I was constantly in fight or flight mode. When your body goes through that much trauma physically and your mind goes through that much trauma emotionally and psychologically, that contributed to me having chronic fatigue syndrome, which is ME, fatigue, brain fog, physical pain.
Trauma is an interruption to the body's nervous system. It changes you physiologically and it changes you neurobiologically and neurochemically. With sexual violence, we are taught to keep these things secret. And the longer that our bodies and our nervous systems live with this interruption, the more severe the consequences are, again, both physically and psychologically. In my case, for example, that 10 years of telling absolutely no one left me with 2 autoimmune illnesses. And that didn't have to be the case.
I put a lot of energy into trying different holistic therapies, physio, chiropractor, acupuncture. It's expensive. I'm trying to get better at putting my energy into different kinds of physical and emotional therapy, instead of, you know, escaping the pain in unhealthy ways.
Everybody needs customized support, and finding all the different organizations that can help you to get that is hard. There's just not enough space in the NHS to provide free support. Organizations that provide that are underfunded. So survivors often have to take that hard work themselves of doing that while also trying to live. I was helping 2 friends very close to me get out of abusive marriages. The UK has a very well-funded civic space and public space when you compare it to the rest of the world. So I expected services to be very robust. But I found that the whole thing felt designed around what the organization felt comfortable with, rather than thinking about what do survivors need, and also which kind of survivors are being left out of the system. You know, there's so much focus on go to the police, do this, do that, do that, and so much less focus on how are you doing and what do you need right now. to live your life, to deal with this. And to understand that healing is not linear. You know, healing can go, someone could be doing really well and then dip down. It can be circular. It is like, for some survivors, it's a lifelong process. For others, you know, their healing journey looks different.
I think the loneliness of it is one of the worst things. That silence around it. Her friends followed us up the stairs to her bedroom. I heard the door lock from the outside, and I realised what I had to do to leave. I thought if that had been a man, this would be a rape, but because it wasn't, then I pushed it out of my mind. It took 10 years to be able to class this as sexual violence. I'd experienced some sexual abuse as a child and teenager, and so I was already programmed to accept a certain amount on my body, that it was okay because it was me that it had happened to. Even like years and years later, when I did seek some support, I didn't feel I could access sexual violence services because I felt like what had happened to me wasn't bad enough or wasn't real sexual violence, and it would be taking up the space of someone who had experienced worse. Eventually, I was picked up in a gynecology appointment where I wasn't able to allow the doctor to examine it. Like, it was very difficult. And she then wrote a referral for trauma-focused CBT. There was a real surprise that I'd been assaulted by women. It wasn't even in her consciousness that that could be a thing. She explained that I was going to have to tell the story in words in like excruciating detail. At that point, I couldn't speak like I can now, because everything shut down every time I tried to. It was a luck of the postcode that there happened to be an EMDR therapist on the staff. I'd have to like just think of a snapshot. It took quite a while to do anything, but then eventually my brain started changing. My brain went to loads of quite violent places, like I chucked her out the window in one of the visualizations. You know, I think I set fire to a building, and another one. Well, it partly feels like your brain's taken out and like bashed around for an hour and a half, and it's really horrible. But it also feels like coming out of the other end of that. So I guess it's the reworking of the story to have some agency and strength or power within it, not just to be paralysed. Even though I'm queer and out and I'm really proud, accessing support in these settings where I'm vulnerable, it's a huge extra layer. I need it to be really clear that people are actually not homophobic. I felt like I've been like repeatedly punished for something other people did, and still am being, in that I'm still living with chronic illness. I just fucked off that like the cost of it all in all ways.
I had to put a mirror in front of my face and actually tell myself that I'd been raped, because I struggled to come to terms with that. This was when we had just fled the war in Sierra Leone. And then this is me a few years later in the refuge camp. So you can see the camp behind. It's me like literally smiling, not having a clue about what actually was going on. There was a lot of violence that I did unfortunately witness quite young. I would not be able to sleep at night because I'm scared my mom's going to get murdered, because we've seen her always be murdered in front of us, and still have to go to school the next day. If you're sleeping in a classroom, you're seen as disruptive. But there's a pattern of me not being awake in class, so why is it that there was no like intervention? They just saw me as a young, black, angry girl. I was suffering from like depression, anxiety, I'd have really bad panic attacks, I had like eating disorders, and then I was like self-harming. My first, I would say, like proper relationship, I'm now about 16. 6 months into the relationship, I was raped. It happened in my bedroom, right? My siblings were actually in the house. It wasn't in an alleyway, it wasn't by a stranger, it was someone that I loved. There was a particular pharmacy that I would go to regularly to get morning after pill because he was like, I'm going to get you pregnant so that you can never leave me. They had told me that I had exceeded the amount of morning after pills I could take, and they still hadn't realised that maybe something is wrong. When you grow up around estates, you're told you don't call the police, and just seeing how the police dealt with my mum when she was experiencing abuse by my father and a lack of support from like social services, etc., that just quite put me off. There was an incident where he almost did murder me. Thank God a neighbour in the opposite estate had called the police, and in that moment it was like I needed help. I recorded the statement and it wasn't recorded. After almost just being murdered, I've now been brave to go and speak about that situation there, and they're telling me the whole thing hasn't been recorded, so I need to come back and record. So then I was like, do they believe me? This is coming together. The day after I was almost murdered, I remember going to the GP. My back was really hurting and the bruises, and I was just worried if something was broken. Sitting here, I can still visualize what I looked like not even what I was wearing necessarily or what my hair was like, but more of how exhausted my soul was then. And she was just typing. There was no like emotional kind of like support, like telling me maybe that's not my fault, because in that moment you feel like it's your fault that you almost got murdered because they're still gaslighting you while almost trying to murder you, right? I had no follow-up, I have no counselling. From that moment, I hadn't accessed a GP for loads of years because I was like, what's the point? And that led to a lot of health problems that I'm kind of basically having to deal with now.
My Lord and my Father, I thank you so much for gathering us to be here together with these two amazing friends. I thank you, my God, for putting me in a position where I'm in a much better place, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, just holistically. So in Jesus Christ's name I pray, amen.
I would say I've just spent a lot of time loving myself, finding out things that I couldn't find out in my childhood because I was constantly in survival mode. I want to be a role model, like real life, like what it feels like to be resilient, but what it also feels like to have tough days. Removing that shame culture that is associated with sexual violence, especially within the Black community. I'm going to speak on it, because if not me, then who?
African and Caribbean heritage women affected by domestic and sexual abuse face an array of barriers. Getting agencies to even first see them as a victim. Oftentimes our service users are faced with stereotypes, so before they even get to explain why they're there with the agency, they're first having to explain their identity. And oftentimes service users will only report once, so if you have a negative experience when going to report, you're not likely to use that agency again.
53% of LGBT plus people experience some form of sexual violence in their lifetime. Over half of those people said that their LGBT plus identity was a factor in that. What LGBT plus survivors talk to us about is that real shame and guilt around what has happened to them that makes it more difficult to come forward and to talk to anyone about what has happened to them. Often, when they do disclose, when they do tell somebody about what has happened, their experience is minimised or invalidated, and there are an awful lot of victim blaming kind of narratives and stories that go along with that. For trans and non-binary people, they are even less likely to be able to access the support that they need. Having that space where they know they won't be judged, their experiences will be understood, and they don't need to explain who they are and their identities is incredibly important.
Coming in here. Welcome.
Thank you. I would say, like, one of the best bits of advice I ever had, if anyone is on this journey of wanting to talk about their experiences, is somebody said, show your scars, not your wounds. Oh, wow. So I feel like, you know, I'm at a time and distance where I'm now really starting to publicly talk about what I went through. Yeah. It took me a while to get here.
You experienced your assault, like, during conversion therapy?
Yeah. I started conversion therapy at 15, following confessing to an elder within my church about my trans identity. You're told to confess everything, confess all the thoughts so that it can be put before Jesus and so that you can be forgiven and then in turn be saved and cured and be able to live, you know, the life Jesus wants us to live. The grooming happened when I was 15 to 16. The abuse was when I was above the age of 16.
Yeah.
Just. I'm about 15 years old here. And right after this time would be the sort of time that my abuser started one-on-one sessions with me.
Oh my God.
And then this final one, I've had 2 years of conversion therapy. I was so angry at this point, and I was going out drinking and vomiting. What became an alcohol addiction and then later on drug abuse. I personally feel you can see that there is a life in the eyes that is drained from my life.
How long would you say it was until after that you realised that that was assault and that you had been taken advantage of? And
yeah, so it actually took me 4 years.
Yeah.
I was at dinner with my friend and she was telling me about experiences she had had with a nanny and a family friend and all these sorts of things and the ages that she was at when all this happened. And I just kind of went, oh, that happened to me, doesn't that happen? At which point this girl kind of looked at me and her face just kind of dropped. And I just kind of realized that, oh yeah, like this is why I can't, you know, I realized there were certain traits about myself, like why I can't be touched, why I couldn't be intimate with people, why I couldn't be all these things, and I wasn't able to put my finger on it.
how long was it then until you went to the police, and how did you find that as an experience?
So it was following the Me Too movement, which I believe was 2017. I decided to do a historic case of sexual abuse against the church, and against the individual as well.
The police did say to me, we want to do something because none of this feels right. But legally, I was above the age of consent and he wasn't a qualified therapist acting as a therapist. Therefore, he actually hasn't broken the law.
As a teenager, it's a completely new world and there will always be them predatory men.
Completely.
And when you said that, like, you know, that he had gotten you drunk,
yeah,
you know, I like it's exactly like similar experiences of like being like a teenager and then some like old guy gets me drunk, you know, and has sex with me, and it's not until I think you're a fully grown adult that you look back and you go, oh my God. I think when you get to like when you start approaching like the person who assaulted you, when you start approaching their age or something, you know, and like, you finally have like all this wisdom that then you realise that like
you suddenly realise
what happened to you
was my
not
age
okay.
and I was When I was 23, I really began to suffer from crippling panic attacks, very intense depression, and so I've been in therapy for 10 years now. This has been everything from CBT style therapy, psychoanalyst therapy. I've gone through 4 or 5 different therapists who all specialize in a different area of therapy, because the one that might deal with relationships is not a specialist in trauma, and the one who's specialist in trauma response is not an experienced in sexuality and LGBT. And
did you think it was important to find a therapist who did have experience working with LGBT plus survivors?
Yes, so at first I completely did the wrong thing, and I went with a therapist who was very good with trauma.
Yeah.
And then when I was discussing my trans identity, yeah, definitely that first therapist negated my trans identity in relationship to my trauma and understanding the intersectionality of it.
And when you're at that point in your transness where you're just figuring out yourself, any kind of like someone doubting that can just set you back years, can't it? And then it can be even longer before you end up coming out.
You kind of don't really realize that until you leave and then go into trans affirming or like LGBT affirming care, and then you suddenly go, oh my word, like, God, it was really toxic.
In terms of loving myself, coming out was one of the biggest actions I could do of love for myself.
I've actually been meeting other trans people that grew up in the area I was in and or went to the church that I was in. And I have to say, it has been so healing. It's not necessarily in a center or with a service, but having those people turn around to me and say, you're not crazy.
Yeah.
You're not I was there. I was there.
Imagine if for the past 10 years, you know, all these trans exclusionary radical feminists and this whole TERF movement, this anti-trans movement, imagine if, you know, them and all us trans activists, instead of, you know, fighting each other, imagine if we used to work together to, you know, support survivors of sexual assault. You know, I think we really could have done amazing things, and I don't think it's too late.
You know, we have different means, we have different journeys that we're on, we have different identities, but ultimately our goal is the same, which is safety, and to be safe, and to make us feel, all of us feel safe.
I think building a community around sexual violence is really important. There's just something really heartbreaking about all these people feeling so isolated at the same time. We can all help support survivors, even if we don't have our own stories to tell. Or if we do have our own stories to tell but don't feel able yet to tell them, we can wake up every day and be the type of person who is open to hearing them.
Creating nuance of understanding around survivors' experiences, it is our responsibility to do that. It is so difficult for survivors to speak up about something that's so personal to them, and the worst moments of pain for them. When you ask survivors, why are you putting yourself through it? They say, because I don't want this to happen to anyone else. So they're providing a public service by going through an extremely traumatizing process, but they can't even get help.
Think about how you use your allyship and who it's actually benefiting. Believe them, for a start. Check your stereotypes, check your unconscious bias. Just take the time to kind of unpack what's going on in your own head. And start with self.
I see that they don't compensate for suffering they cause. Good intentions are misplaced, it's smothering free thought. Advantage is taken, we're late to be changing so much that we've always been taught. Let's try again, go back to beginnings. I don't want to ignore. Sophie